Yeah, just send him a note so that he knows. What? No, I didn't, but maybe just let him know. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'kol niyeh b'dvaro. So last week we spoke a little bit about some.
The Zoom doesn't work. People on the Zoom.
Okay, are you talking to them? Okay, tell them that we're waiting for the computer to charge. The battery was dead. Okay. Okay. So yesterday or last week we began our discussion about this idea of Hotza'ah and Eruvin and how all of this ultimately ties together. We're going to continue with that discussion with a little bit of a historical perspective on Eruvin, which is a fascinating topic, a little bit of a historical perspective on Eruvin that will ultimately lead us up to the modern day Eruvin that we have, the Eruvin Great Neck, Eruvin other places, where it stems from and how we can understand the fundamentals that are part and parcel of putting an Eruv together. We've spoken about some of them, but we'll try to understand them a little bit more. So if we think about the Jewish community from a historical perspective, it was generally a Jewish community that lived by itself, either because, certainly until the emancipation, either because the Jews wanted to live by themselves, right, live in communities of their own, or because the non-Jews wanted the Jews not to live among them, so the Jews lived in communities of their own. In other words, ghettos were not always imposed on us by authorities. Ghettos were sometimes choices that the Jews made among themselves. And generally the communities up until the emancipation, generally Jewish communities, which were separate from the non-Jewish communities, were surrounded by some kind of barrier. And those barriers were often walls. There were walls around the community, and there were gates that controlled access to this community. Maybe one gate, maybe several gates that controlled access to the communities. Right? Think about these are the Jewish communities that we're accustomed to talking about. We talk about ghetto. We hear the word ghetto, we think ghetto, what do we think of? The Warsaw Ghetto, we think of terrible things. But ghettos were not necessarily imposed on us. Sometimes they were communities of our own choosing. And they were surrounded by walls and gates. And the fact that the communities were surrounded by walls and gates actually made the carrying on Shabbos in those communities much easier to accommodate. And what's the reason for that? So if you remember back to our initial class, in our initial class we discussed the different kinds of domains, right? How to divide up areas into domains of different definitions. The easiest to understand was the Rishus HaYachid, the private domain. That would be your home, right? Your home is the private domain. You have a door, you have a front door, you have a back door, you have walls that surround your home, but your home is your private domain. That's the Rishus HaYachid. On the other extreme, from the private domain, we said was the Rishus HaRabim. That was the public domain. And remember, I said, we're not talking here about a matter of ownership, not talking about something that's owned by an individual as opposed to something that's owned by many, but we're talking about the use of the domain. A private domain was used by an individual or several individuals, as opposed to the public domain, which was used by many people. The public domain could have been owned by one person. It could have been Baron Rothschild's, marketplace, but it was a public domain kind of. So that was a Rishus HaRabim. And we said that there were certain characteristics of a Rishus HaRabim that were debated among the poskim. Anybody remember those characteristics? What defines it as a Rishus HaRabim? No. What defines a Rishus HaRabim as a Rishus HaRabim?
Number of people. 600,000.
Okay, so one criteria that was not embraced by all of the poskim was that there needed to be 600,000 people, not just Jews, 600,000 people who lived in that community or who traversed that community.
In a day.
Now, in a day. Now, not everybody agrees that the 600,000 people was a requirement. Those who said that you needed 600,000 people, so they were actually more stringent. Those who said that you needed 600,000 people, and without 600,000 people, it wasn't a Reshut HaRabim Midioraisa, those people were more lenient. Why? Because we mentioned that a Reshus HaRabim, as the Torah understands it, this public domain as defined by the Torah, there is only one way to carry in this public domain as defined by the Torah. And what is that? Walls and gates. Walls that surround the community and gates that close at night. That is the only way to carry in a Reshus HaRabim Dioraisa. We can't rely on the rabbinic leniency that we mentioned also last week, which is known as a Tsuras HaPesach. I remember I went over to the door and pointed out to you the door frame, which is this Tsuras HaPesach. The words Tsuras HaPesach literally mean the image or the picture, the representation of a door. Rabbinically, the rabbis allowed us to enclose an area using Tsuras HaPesach, side posts and lentils, right? A side post and a transverse, a lentil. Is it a lentil? Lintel. Lentil is what we eat. Lentil's a bean. Lentil is, right. There you go.
Same nutritional value.
So that ability to surround an area and to enclose an area with a Tsuras HaPesach did not apply to a Reshus HaRabim Dioraisa. It did not apply to a biblically defined public space. The only way to enclose a biblically defined public space was through walls and gates that closed at night. Richard.
How about a body of water, like a peninsula, like Great Neck Peninsula?
Okay, we'll come to that. We'll come to that. It was a very interesting question. Right. So first of all, the definition of a Reshus HaRabim Dioraisa, whether or not it required 600,000 people either living there or traversing. God, tough day. Traversing, right? Transversing the lentils, right? On one day, that was left vague in the halacha. It is still vague in the halacha. The Shulchan Aruch brings both opinions and doesn't paskin like one or the other, right? Both opinions. The Ramah doesn't say boo about it. So, is a Reshus HaRabim defined by having 600,000 people? If that's the case, then there are not a lot of Reshus HaRabims in the world, right? There are not a lot of Reshus HaRabims in the world. What?
GW Bridge has 300,000 vehicles a day. So let's say
I said that. Right? I said that last week.
Yeah, I know. Just reviewing some people weren't here.
Right. And the majority of those vehicles are single occupied vehicles. So it's not even 600,000 people. However, right, if we say that a Reshus HaRabim Dioraisa needs 600,000 people, so then there are not a lot of Reshus HaRabim Dioraisas around. Not a lot of cities that would qualify as a Reshus HaRabim Dioraisa. There is, though, a second possible determination of a Reshus HaRabim Dioraisa. Anybody know what that was? We mentioned that as well. And that's a street that runs through the city that is 16 amos wide. How much is an amma?
18 inches.
An amma is 1.5 feet. 16 amos, 24 feet. But if you have a street that is 24 feet wide that runs through the city, then the city might have the definition of a Rishus Harabim
What do
Dioraisa.
you mean it runs through the city? The whole city? Or
It
what?
runs from one end of the city to the other end of the city.
Go ahead.
Right? If you have such a street, then that might be considered a Rishus Harabim Dioraisa.
Northern Boulevard.
If that's the case, we have a problem. Right? Why? Because there were many communities that had a main street that ran through the community that was 24 feet wide.
Yeah.
Right? 24 feet wide is not that big. Right? 24 feet wide is not that big. So many communities, in fact, most communities, had a street, a main street. Where do you think the name Main Street came from? Had a main street that ran through the community that was used to pass through the community. Call it the King's Highway, if you will. And from that main street, alleyways and chutzers, courtyards, and different way, the people lived off of that main street. But many communities had that main street. So in order for a community to be defined as a Rishus Harabim Dioraisa, it had to have a road that was 16 amos wide that went from one end of the city to the other, and 600,000 people. Very few Rishus Harabim Dioraisas around. On the other hand, if we say that you didn't need 600,000 people, and it was sufficient to have a road that was 16 amos wide, 24 feet, going from one end of the city to the other, even without 600,000 people, it would be a Rishus Harabim Dioraisa. That would be a problem, because then you would have many, many more cities that were Rishus Harabim Dioraisas. And remember, if the city is a Rishus Harabim Dioraisa, then it needs to be surrounded by walls and gates. Without walls and gates, can't carry. Okay? So let's think back historically now. Everybody on Zoom, we're getting there, right? Battery's charging, we're getting there, right? So let's think back now historically. Jews who lived in ghettos, either of their own determination or imposed on them by the non-Jewish authorities, basically could afford to take a more stringent opinion about the definition of a Rishus Harabim Dioraisa. Because most of these towns, villages that Jews lived in, had streets that were 24 feet wide that went through the town or through the village. But since those ghettos were surrounded by walls and gates, either to protect the Jewish community of their own doing, or to keep the Jews out of the general community at the imposition of the non-Jewish rulers, so then there was less of a problem. We didn't have to worry about the definition of a Rishus Harabim. Why? We didn't have to worry about it because there were walls and gates. And as long as there were walls and gates around the cities, we could take even the more stringent opinion and say, if I have a street that's 24 feet wide, then I'm a Rishus Harabim Dioraisa, even without 600,000 people. But as the Jewish community started to change during the emancipation, and as the walls of the ghettos started to come down, I'm not talking about the Nazi ghettos, but as the walls of the ghettos started to come down, remember there were Jews who lived in ghettos in the 15th century, the 16th century, long before the Nazis were around. There were Jews who lived in ghettos, often of their own choosing, often of their own choosing. Right? So when the walls of the ghettos started to be broken down in the emancipation, and Jews were now allowed to live outside of these areas together with their non-Jewish neighbors, the rabbis were now faced with a bigger problem. And what was the bigger problem? How do I make an Eruv? Why? Because Jews were accustomed to carrying. This idea that Eruv is a modern day invention is absolutely not true. Rabbi Adam Mintz has wrote his doctoral dissertation on the history of Eruv, and a fascinating read. If any of you are interested in it, let me know and I'll share it with you.
Date as to when you think that basically started?
Eruvin?
Yeah.
Eruvin already discussed in the days of the Gemara.
Correct. But I'm saying establishment of the practicality of the Eruv?
In the Middle Ages, right? I mean, Jewish communities had Eruvin. In other words, there were, as far back as we can pretty much tell, and in the days of the Mishnah in Maseches Eruvin discusses Eruvin, right? So there were obviously Eruvin going back then to the days of the Mishnah. When was the Mishnah? Mishnah was 200 of the Common Era. The Gemara, right? The Gemara was redacted 500 of the Common Era. Certainly from that time and forward, there were communities with Eruvin. Did every community have an Eruv? No, of course not. Jews didn't live in communities the way that we understand. There was no South Shore, there was no North Shore. Jews didn't live in communities the way that we live in communities today. But there were always Eruvin, and the reason there were always Eruvin, which is something that I mentioned last week, is because carrying was so much a part of everyday life. Transferring from one domain to another, the courtyard to the private house. People didn't have room to store things. They didn't have room to cook. They didn't have room, right? You wanted to eat chicken for Shabbos. What'd you have to do? You had to catch the chickens. Where were the chickens? You didn't grow the chickens in your house. Chickens were in the courtyard. And what'd you have to do after you caught them? You had to shech them. And then after you shechted them, what did you have to do? You had to pluck the feathers. Trust me, you do not want to pluck feathers inside your house. Right? You had to pluck the feathers, right? And you had to kasher the chickens. Where did all of that take place? All of that took place in the courtyard. Jerry mentions cholent. People cooked cholent. There were communal cooking facilities, right? People didn't have ovens to bake. You know, we have 2 ovens, right? People have 3 ovens: milchik oven, fleishik oven, parav oven, pesach oven, right? They didn't have ovens. Individual homes didn't have ovens. There were communal ovens. So if you were baking challah in the communal oven, people brought food back and forth. People went to each other's homes. It was unheard of, right? Today, you go to someone's house. You don't bring food. Maybe you'll bring some cookies or a candy dish or a bottle of wine or flowers. But the host, what does the host do? The host provides enough food for everyone. That didn't happen. Jewish community wasn't wealthy like that. Jewish community wasn't one household able to provide all that food for all these guests. People brought their food. How did chasanas used to take place? Chasanas took place Friday afternoon, and the Suda went into Shabbos because everybody brought their Shabbos food, and that was the Suda of the chasana. It wasn't like you didn't go to Ram Caterers or whatever. Maybe I should say Letterman Caterers. I don't know. Right?
We're talking about commercials.
This commercial break?
In the DP camps, all the weddings took place on Erev Shabbos.
On Erev Shabbos. That was what the community was accustomed to. That was absolutely what the community was accustomed to, Jerry. Okay, let's see if we can get on Zoom here. We're working on this.
The famous ghetto is in Venice.
Oh, we'll talk about that also. Okay, let's see.
So you say somebody carried today in a place that didn't have 600,000 people, is violating the din of the Rabbanan? Or would you say he's violating the din of the Torah?
It depends, Steve. It depends on how we paskin. In other words, if we paskin that you need both a road of 16 amos from one end of the city to the other and 600,000 people to be Rishus Harabim D'Oraisa, then anyone who carries in a place where there are not 600,000 people, even if there's a road, is D'Rabbanan. If you say, no, a Rishus Harabim D'Oraisa is defined simply by a road of 16 amos, and you don't need 600,000 people, and remember, that's not clear in the halacha, right? There's a lenient position and a stringent position. If you take that the road itself is sufficient, then it's Rishus Harabim D'Oraisa.
And the carrying would only be if you carry on that road, not if you carry walking up towards that.
It would certainly be if you carried on that road. But if there's another area that's attached, right, that's connected to that road, then the question is, what about carrying in that other area? What would that be? Right. So these are issues. Remember, just historically, I guess we lost people. Remember that just historically, communities tried to have Eruvin in order to accommodate Jews who needed to carry. But as the Haskalah movement continued to grow, the emancipation continued to grow, Jews moved out of communities, we had another phenomenon. What was that other phenomenon? This was now Jews who were not observant, right? Jews who rejected the traditions. And rabbis then talked about establishing Eruvin so that Jews who didn't observe the Shabbos would not be guilty of carrying. In other words, if I have an Eruv around the community, and listen, think back to the days when Rabbi Wolf and Larry Schiffman, right, created this Eruv around the community. Probably Rabbi Lerner was involved in it also, although it might have preceded Rabbi Lerner. It's before, right? Larry Schiffman and Rabbi Wolf, when they worked on creating the Eruv around Great Neck, it wasn't necessarily for the frum Jews who lived in Great Neck so that they could carry their Sidurim and Talesim to Shul. It was in order to benefit the many Jews who lived in Great Neck who didn't keep Shabbos, so that they wouldn't be guilty of carrying.
Very generous, because I was on that committee, and I really think they weren't so concerned with Temple Bethel's carrying.
Okay,
Why do
Charlie.
some people in Great Neck not recognize?
We have a long way to go to get there. We have a long way to go. It's not just Great Neck. Any community where there's an Eruv, by definition, there are people who don't hold by it, right? You know, every right. It's the nature. I think I told you that. I mentioned the joke to you of the fellow who was converting.
No,
Right?
mention it, yeah.
Right, I mentioned it,
No,
right?
you didn't say it.
Right, the fellow who's converting, and you know we have a halacha that a non-Jewish person is not allowed to keep Shabbos. So even someone who is converting, until he or she actually converts, he's not allowed to keep Shabbos. That's a halacha. An interesting halacha, a halacha nevertheless. So there was this fellow who was converting, very serious, and he had a chavrusa. With another fellow. They were studying together, and the topic of a non-Jew observing Shabbos came up, and the fellow who was the second fellow who was Jewish said to the prospective convert, "So what do you do to not violate this prohibition? Right? You're not Jewish yet. What do you do to violate Shabbos?" So he reached into his pocket and took out a key. He said, "I carry my key on Shabbos." So the guy he's learning with said, "But how does that help? There's an Eruv." So the convert says, "I don't hold by the Eruv." Right? So there's wherever you have an Eruv, Jerry, you're going to have people who don't hold by an Eruv. That's always been part of the history of Eruvin. You've always had rabbis on both sides of the issues, right? Those who were lenient, those who encouraged the building of Eruvin, and those who were stringent, those who didn't, who passled the Eruvin that others built. You always had this tension, right, in the community, right? Right, and we're going to talk about the Eruv in St. Louis. We're going to talk about the Eruv in Toronto. Talk about the Eruv in the Lower East Side, the Eruv on the East, the Eruv in Manhattan. Lots of different Eruvin and the historical background behind these Eruvin and how the rabbis debated the issues that were there. But as we continue to flesh this out, I want to try to nail down, at least make the principles clear, because any discussion of the modern day Eruv is going to be based on these concepts, these ideas. So one concept is the concept of how do you define a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa? As long as Jews lived in communities where there were walls and gates, we weren't so concerned with that definition, because even if we took the stringent definition, the walls and gates helped. But as Jews moved out of the communities with walls and gates, as the walls and gates came tumbling down, so to speak, so the question became much more significant. Because again, a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa has to have walls and gates. It's Tzuras HaPesach, this wires around doesn't help a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa. A second issue that became a significant issue, and this issue is already discussed back in the days of the Mishnah. Remember what we said about Eruv. There are two components to when we say a community has an Eruv. There are two components. Component number one is a physical border or boundary around the community. Again, if the community is a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa, walls and gates. If the community is not a Rishus Aram D'Oraisa, Tzuras HaPesach, around the community. If I'm using terminology that you don't, that's not clear, just yell at me, throw something at me, stop me, and I'll translate. So that's number one, a physical boundary. And remember what the second thing was? We discussed it last week. It was the combining of food. In other words, when all of the families that lived in the community would contribute to a communal pot of food, so to speak, they would symbolically mix their properties together. By everyone contributing to this communal food, then this neighborhood would now be considered a jointly owned neighborhood. It would be a large Rishus HaYachid, if you will. Okay?
If somebody didn't contribute, he couldn't carry.
Oh, there you go. Here's the point. What if someone didn't contribute to this communal food? Not only is the question, can he carry or not? The question is, does that compromise the other people? In other words, I live in an enclosed, I live in a ghetto, right? And in the ghetto, there happened to be, I guess maybe the ghetto is not the best.
You can live in a town, these new towns in Florida that are enclosed communities. Gated community in Florida.
Okay. I live in a gated community. I want to go back sort of like the Middle Ages perspective, just so that we can build slowly. Right? I live in a community with houses that share courtyards, and there happens to be 2 non-Jews living there. There's 20 Jewish families and 2 non-Jewish families. It was unusual, but it happened. Right? 20 Jewish families, 2 non-Jewish families. The Mishnah already discusses this. So the 20 Jewish families are going to put their food together. They're going to combine their portions of the courtyard, but the non-Jews are not contributing to this. So doesn't the fact that the non-Jews are not contributing to this ruin the combined courtyard for everyone else? And the answer is yes, it does. It does. Because how can you have a combined courtyard if of the 22 residents in the courtyard, 2 residents are not combining their property? In order to have a combined courtyard, everybody needs to combine their property. Because otherwise, how is the courtyard combined? So it only works if everyone combines their property. But these 2 non-Jewish families, they're not combining their property. It's not shaykh to them. It's not relevant. Carrying Shabbos is not relevant to them. So what do we do under those circumstances? Not my question. The Mishnah asked this question. So the Mishnah says that the Jewish community, the other 20 families, needed to lease their properties for Shabbos. In other words, pay them money to do what? To acquire accessibility to their properties. That's what I mean by lease. It wasn't like the non-Jewish families moved out and the Jewish families moved in. No, the non-Jewish families continued to live there. But they leased access to those properties. Financially, they actually paid money to the non-Jewish families to lease access to those properties. Okay? Fascinating, right? And this is what's called in the Mishnah schiras rishus. Right? They would rent access, if you will, rent an ability to be in the domain, in the courtyard that belongs to those families. And that was a principle. That was a principle. Did they have to do it every week? Did they have to lease it every week? Or was it sufficient to lease it once a year, or once every 5 years, or once every 10 years? That's an interesting discussion that the commentaries debate. But everybody agrees that they needed to lease the properties, they needed to lease access to the properties of the non-Jews. Richard.
The families declined the leasing.
If the families declined the lease, you couldn't carry. Families declined the lease, you couldn't carry. What did this help to accomplish? What did this help to accomplish? It helped to make sure that Jews didn't live together with non-Jews. Because if my living together with a non-Jew would compromise my ability to carry on Shabbos, because they refuse to lease their properties, refuse to lease access to their properties, so that would be a problem. So this has a historical perspective. Now the question is, in the days of the Mishnah, days of the Gemara, relatively easy, right? It didn't happen that much, right? There weren't that many non-Jews living in Jewish neighborhoods, and it was relatively easy to lease. It was a symbolic kind of gesture, right? You gave them symbolic. You gave them a small amount of money, and that gave you access to their properties. And now all of the properties were combined together. But it's not only non-Jews who could destroy the mixture of the communities. It could also be non-observant Jews, Jews who didn't accept Eruv, Jews who could care less about Eruv. Right? Those Jews weren't interested in mixing their properties together. So now you had 22 Jewish families living in a community. 20 of those families were observant and 2 of those families were not observant. What do you do with those 2 families? Can you apply the same principle to those 2 non-observant families to lease access to their shares, in which case the community could be combined together? Okay, so now let's take that and imagine how we apply that to Great Neck, Manhattan, South Shore, right? Where there are many non-Jews living here. And I promise you, we do not go to every non-Jewish family and lease access to their properties. We've never done that. We don't go to non-observant Jewish families and lease access to their properties. So how do we do this? How do we mix our community together? And we do. We all carry. I'm pretty sure we all carry, right? So how do we mix our communities together?
Tax code.
Isn't there
Oh, what do you mean? What are you saying?
The taxes, community.
What do you mean taxes?
Real estate taxes and civil taxes.
How does that help to mix communities together?
Everybody puts money into that pot of taxes.
Right, but we don't consider that a commingling of
It's
properties.
commingling of taxes.
It is a commingling of taxes, that's for sure.
Your taxes go
We
to
don't
the
consider
politician, my taxes go to that
consider that a
politician.
commingling of. But can you think, might there be another way to do this, rather than approaching every individual non-Jewish family?
Well, I'm allowed to do a mitzvah on behalf of somebody else, because technically it will benefit him. I don't need permission to do that.
If the city authorizes it.
Okay, that doesn't apply to non-Jews.
Owning the property.
Doesn't apply to
It
non-Jews.
applies to the Jews who are
Okay,
not-
I don't want to. We'll get there. We're talking about non-Jews, right? How do I
Owning the
include?
entire area.
The city authorizes.
How do I include non-Jews in the commingling of property without going to every single non-Jewish family and symbolically leasing access to their property, Richard?
We all share the same water pipes, sewage pipes,
Right.
so
And like the
those water
electrical-
pipes, the association includes everybody.
electrical.
No, that is true that there are certainly things that we share, but that doesn't denote or connote a commingling. I'm having a tough time today. A commingling of properties.
Speak to PSENG and you have all the same electrical.
Right, but we're getting closer. You're on the right track, Jerry.
Owing to the governing authority.
Ah, okay. Wait a second. You did? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Eminent domain.
Right? What? Maybe there's another way to do this. Right? Maybe there's another way to do this. And what is that? That is there any right? In other words, I wanna lease access to non-Jewish family A and non-Jewish family B's property. One way of doing it is to go to non-Jewish family A and non-Jewish family B and give them money and lease access to their property. Okay, that's easy. That's what the Mishnah talks about. But there's another way of doing this. And that is, if there is someone else who also has access to their property, I can lease access through that third party. Who might that third party be? Government. And there is a fascinating discussion about what government official qualifies to do this. So the Shulchan Aruch writes, the Shulchan Aruch codifies that it needs to be a government official who has the authority during time of war to place arms and people in any home that he desires. Okay? That's the kind of communal authority that we're looking for. There are other discussions that say it needs to be somebody who can redirect traffic on the roads. It needs to be somebody who has that kind of authority, right? Today, what do? So I will tell you what happens with the Great Neck Erev. I have a document in my office. I didn't remember to bring it up. Yirtzeh Hashem, I'll bring it tomorrow. A document in my office from the Nassau County municipality, right? From the village, the town of North Hempstead, right? The town of North Hempstead, that allows, that by which we rented out access to all of the communal property and non-Jewish property in Great Neck.
From the county executive?
Okay, from at the time we did it, it was Judy Bosworth. Right? She was the one. We had a meeting. Larry Schiffman and I went to the meeting. We sat at the meeting. Imagine a meeting like this, because once we made the initial contact, so now everybody's interested. What's going on? Jews are coming. They want to give money. What's going on here? We had a meeting like this. The whole board was sitting around a table, and we explained. And Larry Schiffman is a master. Explained exactly what we were doing. They drew up a document, and we presented them with a few dollars to rent these properties. I don't know if it's for 50 years or 99 years, something like that. Right? I'll share the document with you.
What do you have before?
This had been done many years prior. It had been done, and we felt that it was time to renew, right, the lease. Richard.
How can you do
But I
that?
can imagine,
Henry, hang on just a second.
How can you do
Okay.
that without the authority of the individual property owner?
They represent
Because
us.
the municipality has something called eminent domain. And what does eminent domain mean? That the municipality has the right to confiscate your property.
It's in Atlantic
But
Beach.
don't they have to do that legally with every individual?
Whether they do, they have the right to do it. So since they have the right to do
They
it,
haven't done it.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. In other words, they need to have the right to do it. Since they have the right to do it, since they have the right to have access to your property, halachically, they can serve as the agents to lease access to your property. You never even know about this. You're a non-Jewish person living in Great Neck. You have no clue, unless you stumble upon this video on the internet. You have no clue that the Jewish community has leased access to your property. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This is rabbinic in nature. These are the leniencies that you can lease the property from someone who also has access to that property. So we leased from the town of North Hempstead, but there was another agency that was involved in the lease. Who might that be? The police department. Right? We had the police department, chief of police at that meeting as well. Why? Because the police of Nassau County have access to your property. In case of an emergency, the police have access to your property. They don't need to ask your permission, right? They don't need to show you a search warrant. In case of emergency, if they deem it appropriate, they have access to your property.
Is this limited to only Friday nights and Saturdays?
Is it? That's a good question. I don't know. Why would it make a difference?
You don't have to worry about a neighborhood.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have to look at the language as to whether or not the language specifies that. Not sure that I'll bring it in tomorrow, so maybe I'll make a copy so we can look at
I
it.
wonder.
Henry, go ahead.
Every day.
Henry, go ahead.
Every year.
I wonder, you had corporation in North Hempstead, Nassau County.
Oh.
But it might be that in some areas you don't have cooperation.
So that's a very good point. In other words, it's politically correct for the authorities to cooperate with the Jewish community that wants to do this. So we were able to do it in Nassau County. without a problem. And they do it on the South Shore, clearly without a problem, right? Because the authorities know who votes. So they understand these things, right? They understand these things. And the police department, they sort of go along with anything that,
What was his comment?
his comment was, what if the authorities don't want to cooperate?
West Hampton,
Right? West Hampton, they didn't want to cooperate. And there were, and historically, there were communities where the authority didn't want to cooperate. Why? Because one such instance, the king felt that if he leased access to the Jews, they wouldn't pay their taxes. Other communities where they felt, where the king was advised that if they allowed the Jews to lease access, so the Jews would mount a revolt against the king. So wasn't always that there were communities that cooperated, where there were governing authorities that cooperated. But we need, in other words, the commingling of the properties can only happen through this sechira, through this lease of access, right? So we have two things going on here. We have the boundary definitions, which are changing because the Jewish communities are moving out of the ghettos, the ghetto walls are being broken down. We need to come up with a new understanding of the boundary issue. And now we have a schirus issue. And now as the Jews are moving together with more non-Jews, we have to figure out how to lease access to those non-Jewish properties. These are two things that are developing on concurrent tracks as the history of Eruv unfolds in the Middle Ages. Richard.
It seemed to me to be a lot easier to work with the electric company, the phone company, or the water authorities in individual areas.
The phone company does not have the right to come into your home without your permission.
Come into home, but if you have a border,
You have a border, but they have no access. They don't have access to your property. They might have access if there's a telephone pole on your property. They might have access to the telephone pole, but they don't have access to your property. Right? None of these utilities have access to your property. Right? They have easements. Right? Easements allow them certain areas. Why do you think telephone poles are not in the middle of your front lawn, other than the fact that they would be aesthetically unpleasing? Because the easements only give these utility companies a certain area in which to place these. They have the right to service them, they have the right to deal with them in those areas, but they don't have access to your property. It's not like the police department. It's not like, theoretically, the town of North Hempstead. Town of North Hempstead could confiscate all of your property.
You need both, you need the police too, because
So we did it as a stringency. That's the question, whether you actually need both or not.
some communities here, like Redneck Estates, will have their own police.
But Nassau County trumps their own
I'm not
police.
sure.
I think that Nassau County trumps their own police department, yes. Right, Nassau County police can go into Kensington home, can go into Great Neck Estates home, not a problem.
In
Alan,
Israel, where the majority of Jews and the communities, as well as the government, is a Jewish government, have the same requirements of providing this governmental.
because there are non-Jews who are living there.
That's because even if there's no question of bittul, of the fact that the majority of the people in the community are Jewish.
No, there's no, bittul does not work in this. Right? You can't say since the majority of Jews, because when it comes to commingling of properties, one family can be mevatel the commingling of the properties.
So if there's federal property in town, the police department doesn't have a right to go into federal buildings.
Sure they do.
They can go into federal property
100%.
anytime they want.
100%.
How about fire department?
100%.
they don't need a search warrant or anything.
No.
If there's an emergency, they can go into
Like the
any
Merchant
property they
Marine,
want.
Like the
It's
Merchant
the same
Marine.
for fire department.
Same for the fire department, correct. Same for the fire department. I don't know why they chose the police department, fire department. I don't know. So,
Well,
You said
Volunteers.
something about Manhattan. I thought Manhattan was a natural error. Because it's
okay.
totally
All right.
surrounded
So
by
now let's build on this discussion a little bit. We're going to build on this discussion a little bit, right? And we're running out of time. I apologize, but in Yirtz Hashem, you get me 2 days a week, so we'll continue tomorrow. So now let's focus on the changing boundary issues. Remember, you have the boundary issues and you have the mixture of property issues. Let's focus on the changing boundary issues as the walls of the ghetto break down, as Jews move out of the ghetto to the more non-Jewish areas as well, and start to live now in areas where where the community is no longer surrounded by walls and gates. Okay, so this requires us to take the following position. Position number one: the Jews are not living in a Rishus Harabim D'Oraisa. we have to say that a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa requires not only a road from one end to the other of 24 feet, but also requires 600,000 people living there. We have to say that they're not living in a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa, because if they are living in a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa, the only kind of enclosure that works is walls and gates. So position number one that we need to take is to say that they're not living in a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa. That you don't, right, that you need to have 600,000 people. Position two is now, okay, what kind of boundaries or borders can we create since there are no longer walls and gates? So what did we learn? We learned that if it's not a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa, what works? Tzuras HaPesach. I could create this Tzuras HaPesach. But guess what? The non-Jewish authorities are not allowing me to put up poles and wires, all over the community. Not letting me do that. Right? We're talking the Middle Ages. They're not letting me do that. The non-Jews don't want poles and wires all over their community. So the rabbis are now faced with trying to grapple with what can serve as a boundary, what can serve as a border to the community. So tell me, Sue hinted to it. Tell me, in the Middle Ages, right? What might it be? A body of water, right? A river or a body of water, right? Is a community surrounded by a body of water? Is that community considered enclosed for the purpose of Eruvin or not? Now, think about what this would mean, right? This would mean, I'm pretty sure that Great Britain is an area that is an island, completely surrounded by water. There are bridges that allow you to access the island, but Great Britain is completely surrounded by water. Manhattan is completely surrounded by water. There are bridges that allow there to be access, but it is completely surrounded by water. Okay?
Every island?
So Jerry, if you're on a cruise and God forbid your cruise ship capsizes and you wind up on an island, you can carry on Shabbos. Of course, you won't know which day is Shabbos, but you can carry on Shabbos.
What if there were
Yes.
600,000 people?
Then you don't have to worry about anything else. All right? So the question is, so Avi is obviously asking the correct question. In other words, these water boundaries, question number one is, are they boundaries? Are they really considered boundaries? And question number two is, are they considered sufficient boundaries for a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa? So I'm just going to touch on this and then we'll stop for today, right? What makes a body of water an acceptable boundary? What makes a body of water an acceptable boundary?
The land, height.
The difference in height between the water and the land?
Yeah, I mean, like, if it's a beach, is one thing. If it's a wall that was a beach.
Okay. So there are two things that we have to look at. Number one is there a seawall? Most communities, including Great Neck, by the way, most communities that are bordered by water have a seawall. What's the purpose of the seawall?
Keep the water out. Keep the water out.
To keep the water out,
Yeah.
right? To prevent the erosion of your property, right? That's why you have a seawall. The water smashes up against the seawall and your property remains untouched. So communities have the majority of Great Neck, where it is exposed to the water, has a seawall. But guess what? There are homes in Kings Point that don't have seawalls. What do they have? Beaches.
Money.
They have beaches that the seawall stops before they're home. And they have a sandy beach that goes into the water. What does that do to the Eruv? But you don't even have to be in Kings Point. Great Neck Estates Park has a boat ramp.
Right.
The boat ramp breaks the seawall. Is that a problem? Or is it not a problem? So Mirz Hashem, you don't have to carry between today and tomorrow. Don't worry about it. Or you can carry without a problem between today and tomorrow. Mirz Hashem, we'll continue this tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.